Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. I am about to hop on a live with Eric Maille. I hope I have that correct. The creator of the amazing Ink Witch Tarot, say that 3 times fast, and the Paper Oracle. They are fabulous decks, and he also has the Endless Oracle, which is currently funding on Kickstarter. The artwork that is in these decks is just incredible. I am going to put in Eric to join me, and and then we'll be good to go. This is so exciting. Yay! Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for joining.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, it's my absolute pleasure. How's your weekend going?
It's been good. How's yours?
It's been really excellent. Yeah, we've been car free for almost 4 years now, but we had a car rental to go into Halifax for dental work, and we took in a few farmers markets and did all kinds of fun things. So it's really
Nice.
great.
What is it
Yeah.
like being car free? I feel like are you in the US?
No, I'm in Canada, Nova Scotia.
Oh,
We
okay.
had actually done 20 months of full-time RV with our kids prior to landing in Halifax in 2018. And so went from being in the car all the time to selling our vehicle because we were living downtown and could walk everywhere or take transit. And then during the pandemic, we ended up moving out of our decidedly crappy apartment downtown and into a house in a small town. And when we moved, I just assumed we needed a car right away, right? Small
Mhm.
town, things are further out. And groceries are about a 25-minute walk. But really, outside of the winter, when the snow gets kind of intense, it's actually not that bad. We have a folding
Nice.
cart that we bring to the grocery store and fill up, and we're looking at getting one to attach to the back of our bikes. We will get a car eventually, but it's actually been really nice not having
Cool.
to navigate escalating gas prices and,
Yeah.
feels good to be contributing a little less to environmental issues. I mean,
Yeah.
we do have 2 kids, and there's lots of wonderful things that we aren't able to take advantage of close to us due to not having a vehicle. So it
Mm.
is definitely in the game plan eventually, but it's always exciting when we have the rental and we can take in all the things that we don't get to do regularly. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. That's so neat to me. I feel like people really like having a vehicle just because like there's a sense of independence with that, but there's also like a dependency that you start to have on the vehicle, which is a pain.
Well, we definitely get a lot of our steps in just getting our
Oh,
groceries
I
easily,
know.
and, having to walk somewhere. Because I'm sure if we had the vehicle, we would just hop over to the grocery store because it's so much easier. But when you're forced to walk, it does help get those extra steps in. Not that I'm like terribly militant about it or anything. When I bought my Fitbit, my husband and kids were kind of shaking their heads because they knew that I'd be like really on it, and I admit I have been. But yeah, pros and cons for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I was just telling everyone who's managed to join that you are the fabulously talented creator of Inkwitch Tarot
Oh,
and the Paper Oracle and also the Endless Oracle, which is currently on Kickstarter until September
yeah.
6th, I believe. Yeah,
Fifth, I think.
5th. Okay, I made
Yeah,
a note of it here. I must have. Okay, awesome.
I might
I'm
be
also
wrong
in
too.
Atlantic time, so if the cutoff is on
Oh,
uh, Central time, it probably tells me, or on the 5th. Yeah, with the time difference,
right.
sometimes it pushes it ahead a
It
day.
is
So,
probably
um,
the sixth for you.
yeah, 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 for sure. So I'm so curious how your tarot creation came about. Like, is the Inkwitch the first deck that you created?
It is,
Yeah.
yeah. It's the
So,
first one I created. I finished it in 2020, I think. When everything was shut down, it gave me a lot more time to work on it and get more serious about it, which I think is kind of the story that a lot of newer deck creators have. But I had started it like 2 or 3 years prior to that, and worked on it just real slowly over the course of a couple of years. And when I set out making it, it wasn't even going to actually be like a finished tarot deck originally. I was just doing like this little art challenge where over the course of a month, every day, I was going to draw one card, and they weren't meant to ever be put into a deck. They were just going to be like a little art project for me. And I had a much smaller audience at the time than I do now, but the people who were like following my work were really excited about it. And when I was finished, I got a lot of messages that were like, when is that coming back? Like, when are you finishing the tarot deck? And I was like, oh no, I'm not finished. Like, it is finished. Like, I'm not making a tarot deck. I'm just like making some drawings. And
Yeah.
people were disappointed about that. And so I kind of started thinking, I would like to have a finished tarot deck that I had made myself, something that I would use. And so over the course of the next couple of years, I just gradually kept making more and more until I had all of the cards. And then there was the whole process of learning how you get something like that printed. But
Yeah.
originally it wasn't even going to be like a full, complete, usable tarot deck. So it was kind of a surprise.
I kind of love that because some artists will approach the deck as something intentional, that it's going to be a full 78 cards and this is what I'm planning to do. But I've talked to a lot of other creators who it's happened kind of organically or by surprise, or you set out kind of just sketching something and then next thing you know, there's this full amazing deck. Well, I'm so glad that you stuck with it because this deck is phenomenal. I love your art style. I was looking at so it's let me see here. I made some notes. So it's ink and watercolor. There we go. I have a whole page full of notes and I got lost there for a second. So ink and watercolor, and you use primarily gray tones in both warm and cool, but with little splashes of color. I love that approach because it brings specific things into focus. Like the death card in particular, that was the first card that I pulled when I got the deck, and I just love the little splash of red and pink that you have for the pomegranate because it pulls it into focus so beautifully. And I also love the myths and legends that you incorporate. Like, I know this is the Lady of the Lake for Arthur, right? Yeah, and then you've got Persephone, of course, from Greek mythology. And then I love Odin as the Hanged Man. That's who the reference is, right? Yeah, and Anubis as well. I homeschool my kids, and we've spent a lot of time focusing on mythology, Egyptian, Greek, Norse, Roman, and I get really excited when I find decks that reference all of these legends because and myths because it's such. I mean, what's tarot if not storytelling, right? And to be able to incorporate some of those themes is so magical. So did you, for the challenge that you did, was it the major arcana cards or did you get to pick?
It was the major arcana. I drew the major arcana. It was during October. And so I was doing one a day. And I did the major arcana and then just like some favorites. Like I think I did the aces right away, just to kind of like fill in the extra time after finishing the majors.
Yeah, that's awesome. So which cards were the most fun for you to create?
It's a good question. I think that the ones that were the most fun for me were the ones that kind of like subverted the typical like imagery. So I really liked doing the Two of Cups, which is like two coffee cups, like very modern.
Yeah.
I liked, there's a few cards that have my own personal car on them, like the Chariot and the Star. And so it was kind of fun to throw like something a little like sort of randomly modern into the deck.
The little cat on the top.
Yeah. I think those are the ones that I kind of had the most fun making overall.
Yeah. Well, I love too that you've got myths and legends, but you also incorporate the magic of the everyday. I think you put it in the listing. And like these coffee cups, like that. Magic doesn't have to be specific things that you have to seek out at a specialty store. Like one thing that I've discovered with my own practice is that there's magic to be found in the simplest things. I don't know about you. I wasn't a big coffee drinker before the pandemic hit. Like I have it maybe once or twice a week. I was always more of a tea person. And then the pandemic hit and my daily coffee ritual has become a bit of a lifeline for me. Like a ritual of preparing a cup of coffee in the morning and in the afternoon, or a matcha latte. That's like 5 minutes that I get to hand grind my beans and set the kettle at a specific temperature. And it's 5 minutes out of my day that I can be fully present. doesn't matter if the dog is barking or the cat is meowing or the kids are having a dispute in the background, like that's time that I can be fully present. And I love that you have, and also the Ace of Cups has that coffee cup.
Oh
It's
yeah.
like I love coffee, but I love the ritual just as much. And there's so much power in that every day. It's those little things that you do, even brushing your teeth can be a
Mhm.
ritual if you decide to pick a specific toothpaste that you like the smell of, or there's elements that you can incorporate. You know what I mean? And I love that that's so much a part of this deck.
Thank you.
It's myths and legends, but then there's also really special moments that you incorporate that are so magical. Um, yeah. So once you decided that it was going to become a deck, you already had your aces done and your major arcana done and maybe a few other cards. How did you approach it? Did you do it sequentially through the minor arcana, or did you just go with what inspired you at the time? What was the
Um,
process?
when I was doing the majors, I believe that all of that was in order because I wanted to do it as this little show-offy challenge or whatever, you know? So I wanted it to all be in order. And I think that once I decided like it was going to be a finished usable deck, I did go back and redo some of the majors.
Okay.
Um, but the rest of the cards were just kind of whatever I felt like working on that day. Honestly, there were some that I knew right away, like, oh, I want this card to look this way. And so I could draw that really quickly. And then there were others that like I never really settled on what I wanted that card to be. And so I saved them for the very end and still was kind of like, better than nothing. So
What were some of those cards? I'm so curious if you feel like sharing.
the I think it's the seven. Oh my gosh, it's right on top of my deck. Yeah, the seven. It was waiting for me. The Seven of Swords was
Oh,
one
yeah.
that I couldn't come up with anything for it. And I tried a million different drawings. I had this idea that it was going to be two knights with
Yeah.
their like weapons on a table, but they're both like secretly holding one behind their back. And
Yeah.
I was coming up with these ideas that I liked, but when I tried drawing them, it was like the narrative there just didn't translate. It looked awkward. It looked kind of weird. And so I settled on the artwork that I did eventually just because I couldn't come up with anything better.
Yeah.
But I
I
think
like
that was like
it.
the last card that I drew.
Oh, that's yeah. Well, it's beautiful, and I love like
Thank
the
you.
knights with the hidden swords would have been kind of almost a more traditional reference of,
Mm,
secrecy, deception, something happening behind the scenes. But I love that this one is the fissure, right? And it creates
yeah.
that divide and separation because I think so much of deception and lies and lack of truth telling does create division in relationships and in your experience of life. And I love that you captured this in a non-specific reference in this card. And by non-specific, I mean it's not a replication of everything that's already come
Mm.
before in terms of the Seven of Swords, right? So that's really cool. I love this Eight of Swords too. I'm looking at it too with the
Oh
Magician's
yeah.
Box. All of that.
Thank
It's
you.
awesome. It's really, really
I've
cool.
been really happy at how well that particular card seems to be received by people because that
Yeah.
is one of the ones that I think I came up with fairly early where I was like, oh, this has to be like the magic box trick.
Yeah.
And I was really pleased with that. And so it's always nice if you make something that you're proud of and people really enjoy it because oftentimes I find that I wind up in this situation where the art that I'm kind of like, it is what it is.
Yeah.
People love it. And then the art that I'm sort of like, this is the best thing I've ever made. People are like, yeah, it's okay.
Isn't that always the way though? It's like it's so interesting when you create something and you put it out in the world to see how it's received. I remember reading an article about Bob Dylan one time and he's like, "Yeah, my lyrics don't mean anything. Like I'm glad that people take something from it, but like I didn't come at it with this huge intention and meaning that's been ascribed to it later." But I think that's part of the magic of art, whether it's lyrics or it's a painting or an illustrated medium, is that like everyone takes something different from it, right?
Mhm.
So the things that you invest in certain things, some people will see it and appreciate it for that, but then others will see something completely different, and that's part of the magic. I feel like
For
it's
sure.
amazing. So as a non-artist, my daughter is a budding artist, and the things that she creates, she's 14, just blow my mind. But I've never had that skill set. Like I like writing about things, I like taking photographs. But as a non-artist, I would love to know about your process. So it's ink and watercolor. So do you start with an ink sketch and then fill it in with the watercolor? Like, what's that process like?
It really varies from piece to piece. I think I generally use ink and watercolor for the same things. When I use ink, it's almost always markers, though. And so, what I kind of like to do is start with a pencil sketch and just kind of get a composition that I like. And then once I've got that, I'll sort of put ink over just like what I want to be major line work in the finished product. And then I can kind of treat it like a coloring book at that point and fill in my lines. I like to kind of start with watercolor just to cover large areas, and then I'll go back with ink markers and kind of make everything a little bit more detailed and start kind of refining it at that point.
Oh, I love that so much. And the little pops of color that you included, how did you decide that?
Originally, there weren't going to be very much of that. And I guess in Inkwitch, there's really not much of that at all. I think the place where it stands out the most is that death card. But when I had been, before it was going to be a finished thing, I had put on the Empress, I'd put like this really light wash of like a greenish blue, just because that kind of emphasize the like cultivation-y, nature-y quality of it. And so when I did the Emperor, I thought, well, I'm going to do that with kind of like an orangey red. And then the death card, of course, I wanted that pomegranate to stand out. But the rest of the deck, a lot of the color that you can see in those cards is just from the different shades of gray kind of being affected by like digital editing. The warmer grays become a lot more sepia and the cooler grays become a lot more blue. There's very little like intentional color in it, to be honest.
No, but it's really beautiful the way that you've composed everything, because it's got a very kind of soothing feel to it with the gray tones and the sepia and really nice contrasts. Like with this Ace of Pentacles, I love that you've got the earthy sepia tones and then everything else. It's almost like a cloudy sky in the background, and there's something really, really beautiful about that contrast. So what was your process like in terms of finding a printer and, you know, editing proofs and like what was your process with that? How did you find a printer and go through navigate all of that, I guess?
The printer, like finding a printer, I honestly just did like a bunch of Google searching. I couldn't really find a printer who would give you proofs unless you were already placing a pretty big order. And so because that didn't really seem like an option at the time, I thought I'd be pretty lucky if, you know, I sold 100 of them. And most printers want you to be ordering like 1,000 before they give you a proof. And so I needed to find a printer that would just let me print one single deck at a time so that I could have like a test prototype. And so that was honestly a big deciding factor in how I chose my printer. I did a bunch of searching around on the internet and I found one that would let you print a single deck but also had decent bulk discounts just in case I was going to end up buying a lot of them. So that was really kind of how I chose the printer that I did.
Yeah, that's amazing. Did you do a Kickstarter for the first one, or did you just list it on your website?
I just put it on my website. Endless Oracle is actually the very first Kickstarter that I've ever done before.
That's awesome. How's the process been?
It's been good. It's been overwhelming. It's a lot more work than I kind of expected it to be just to set up the Kickstarter. With the other decks that I've released, I just put them on my website, and there was a lot of work involved in like coming up with pricing and a description for the listing, taking good looking photos and all of that stuff. But the Kickstarter is just so much more involved, and it involves a lot of math, which is something I'm terrible at. And so, it's been a much more involved process, but I think it's also been I mean, obviously it's been rewarding, but I think that it's definitely the most like pre-ordered deck that I've made so far. And it's kind of hard to tell how much of that is that I have a bigger audience now, or I have more connections now, or the deck is more attractive to people. It's hard to know like what's contributing to that, but I do think that Kickstarter, having it on Kickstarter versus doing just a pre-sale on my website, I think has been a big impact on it blowing up the way that it has.
Yeah, because you're at what, 400% right now in terms of campaign. Congratulations, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Well, I think one of the benefits, I know I've talked to a lot of creators who have mentioned pros and cons about Kickstarter, and you know, there's benefits and then there's downsides for anything. But I think one of the benefits with Kickstarter is that you can reach a more expanded audience too, because there's somebody who maybe doesn't necessarily already follow you on Instagram that might look up, you know, Oracle on Kickstarter and access your work in that way. So it does open up the audience for sure. That's wonderful. Yeah, in terms of the Kickstarter, I was going to ask you about that. So the Endless Oracle has 50 cards, and then you have a few stretch goals that you've set up. I think the first one was for the 3 extra cards, right? The Fairy Ring, the Cave, and the Rift, and that's already been passed.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there will actually be.
Oh, sorry. Go
there
ahead.
will actually be 53 cards in the base deck now because of those stretch goals.
Oh, wonderful. And then you also had a hard box as well. Like, yeah. And I can't remember what the third stretch goal was off the top of my head.
That was to extend the guidebook.
Yes.
So I'm going to add a bunch of like my creative notes to it and make it wordier. I've got ideas for some spreads that can be added to it. Just kind of widening it out, making it a little bit more extensive.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love guidebooks so much. I have a bunch of them now. I don't need to reference them, but I love them so much because I find getting a deck creator's insights on the cards will sometimes open up my understanding of a card in a way that I hadn't even considered before.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Charlie Claire Burgess, the Word Witch, and their creation is incredible. And their tarot book that comes with the deck blew my mind. Like, it allowed me to look at cards like the Emperor and the Hierophant that I've traditionally struggled with in whole new ways. And I'm so grateful for all of those insights. There's so many books that I've referenced that have just opened up my perspectives in new ways. So the fact that you're expanding that guidebook makes me so excited. I can't wait to work with the deck.
I love a good guidebook. I always am disappointed if I buy a deck and get a guidebook that just has like a sentence for every card. I recently bought a tarot deck that is artwork from an artist named Gustave Doré, who isn't alive anymore. It's just his artwork being put into a tarot deck. But I really wanted the guidebook to say like what art pieces were on the cards and why they were chosen for that card. And there was nothing like that. It was just like a sentence about what the card traditionally means. It wouldn't tell you the title of the illustration or what it was from. I was so let down. I'm a huge fan of a good guidebook that tells you about the artwork itself. So I'm excited to get to use more words in the guidebook and make something a bit bigger.
Well, the Inkwitch guidebook is fantastic. I love that you have all the references for your inspiration for each of the cards, and there's keywords for upright and reversal, and like being able to look through it and see that the word card is referencing Yggdrasil, and you know, Anubis is a reference point for judgment, and what that means to you. I know what that means to me, but being able to hear what it means to you opens up my understanding of that card in such beautiful ways, and I'm so grateful for it. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, I have the PDF copy, but it's really exciting because now you have a hardcover version or a physical copy of the guidebook available on your website as well, right?
Yeah, you do. I had kind of, when I very first made the guidebook, I released it as a physical thing that people could order or as a PDF that you could download for free. And I stopped printing the books just because they're very expensive to print, and I I don't want to charge as much as I would have to really be making much money off of them. So they're
Yeah.
hard to kind of keep around. But I did a couple months ago, like a second pre-order sale for them, and I ordered a few extras. So those are on my website right now. And I'll also be doing that at the end of the Kickstarter. I put the companion book as an add-on in the Kickstarter so people can pre-order that as well. And when I order the guidebooks for Endless Oracle, I'll also go ahead and get some more Inkwitch guidebooks too for people who ordered those.
Absolutely. I love that you had that as an add-on. And that's also, I would imagine, helpful for you because then you have an idea of exactly or approximately how much you're going to need as opposed to doing
Absolutely.
shot in the dark. I think I might need this many, and then it's either above or below what you had anticipated. Yeah, I can
Yeah,
imagine that would be hard. And you
absolutely.
also have an expansion pack for the Inkwitch Tarot that's an optional
Yeah,
add-on as well, and it's 10 additional cards, right? There's a few Lovers
yeah.
cards, High Priestess. So tell me a little bit about that. I love that you have those. That's something.
I had one of the decks that really inspired Inkwitch, or maybe not inspired it, but just one of my favorite tarot decks that whenever I was doing research for Inkwitch, I was looking at just as much artwork for different cards as I could. And one of the decks that I always would refer to is Trung Nguyen's Star Spinner Tarot deck. Love
Oh,
that. And
yeah,
something I loved about that deck was that he included multiple versions of the Lovers cards. That there's one with two male presenting figures and one with two female presenting figures, and then two that are a little more ambiguous. And so when I had the opportunity to make extra cards, I thought it would be really fun to do something like that. And
yeah,
in the deck originally, I had kind of made my Lovers and Devil card so that they'd match each other. So
yeah.
I felt like in an expansion pack, if I'm going to be making more versions of the lovers, that means that I also need more versions of the devil as
Yeah.
well. So that's how I wound up with those. And then I went ahead and added a new King of Pentacles and a new King of Swords,
I
just
noticed
because those weren't, when I finished the original deck, those weren't cards that I was really satisfied with. I just couldn't get to a point where I liked the artwork for them, but I
yeah.
also had to have them in the deck, you know? So doing the expansion pack gave me an opportunity to try those again. And then there's also a Justice card that is in the expansion that's Martha P. Johnson. And I added that just because it was something I had drawn, thinking maybe that's what I would use for the original deck. I already had it. I decided I'd rather do like a protest or like a march for the Justice card. But since I had that extra artwork already around, I wanted to go ahead and use that. And the High Priestess, which you mentioned, that one I added in there because I feel like the High Priestess is a really they're all really important cards, but the High Priestess is one of those cards that like half of everybody who does tarot, it's one of their very favorite cards.
Yeah.
And I really like my original High Priestess. I'm still using that one in my copy of the deck, but I realized it wasn't really resonating with a lot of people.
Okay.
And I think that the guidebook helped. I think when they kind of read what my thought process was, I think a lot of people liked it a lot more. But I thought since that's such an important card and such a favorite card of so many people, I want to make sure that people have access to maybe something that they just vibe with a little bit better that sort of suits their taste more.
I love that so much. And I'm a big proponent of the fact that tarot should be accessible to everyone and everyone should be
Absolutely.
able to see themselves represented in the cards. It allows for a more intimate connection with the
For
practice.
sure.
I feel personally like the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith, I've actually never purchased a traditional RWS deck, which feels like sacrilege to say, but it never hit home for me. Like I love that I have reference books that allow me to look at those traditional images as a reference point, but decks that take that and modernize it or shift the representation so it feels a bit more accessible has always resonated way more with
Mm.
me. And I love that you've included cards that expand the perspective of tarot and allow someone to be able to see themselves represented in it. I feel like that's so important. And um, yeah, I love that so much. And I love your King of Pentacles shows a dragon.
Yeah.
with a bunch of gold, right? Is that a Smaug reference, or is that like what was the
Oh,
inspiration? We just
the
watched
one
Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, so I have that in the back of my mind, of course.
the one with a bunch of gold is that's actually the Four of Pentacles. The King of Pentacles is also a dragon though, but a different
Okay.
dragon. The
Okay.
one who's like sitting on the hoard though, this guy. I
Yeah.
don't know that it's specifically a Smog reference. There's lots of stories about dragons with treasure hoards, and that just seems so appropriate for this card.
Yeah.
But I say used to, I'm still so into like the old animated Rankin Bass Hobbit movie.
Yeah.
And so absolutely when I was working on the card, I was thinking about Smog just
Yeah.
because I love that character. I wouldn't
Yeah.
say that it is Smog, but I that has absolutely crossed my mind.
We do. My best friend lives in St. John's, Newfoundland. We met when we were living there years ago. It's where my son was born. And we do distance movie nights now on Saturday nights.
So
So we
fun.
basically just queue up the movie at the same time and then press start at the same time and then text back and forth. And it's mostly like GIFs and jokes and all kinds of stuff. And it's great. And it's so nice to be able to participate in that at a distance. We started with all the Jane Austen films, and then we've
Oh,
since
cool.
expanded and went back and looked at a bunch of classics from the 80s and 90s, many of which have not aged well. I have to say, my kids were horrified.
Yeah.
It's amazing what seemed really good back in the day, like 20 years ago,
Right.
and now, oh, I'm seeing this through a much more critical lens, and yes, this is
Mhm.
completely inappropriate and what not to do. Um, but then we ended up going into Lord of the Rings. We watched all three Hobbit films, and then the Lord of the Rings was stretched out over many, many weeks because, of course,
That
at
has
like
to
we
be.
watched the extended version, and it's like 4 hours per movie. So it's like,
Right.
okay. But yeah, that's totally in the back of my head when I look at everything now, and it's so funny how you have this like reference point that permeates everything. Um, so I haven't had a chance to look at the entry for the High Priestess in the guidebook. So please tell me about this card and your reference for it
Yeah.
and your thoughts. I'd love to hear it.
Sure. My thought process for that card was that the High Priestess is somebody who, obviously we associate that card a lot with intuitive power, with psychic power. There's also a spiritual aspect and a feminine aspect for people who gender tarot. Not everyone does, but
Yeah.
traditionally, High Priestess, obviously with the name, really feminine.
Hmm.
And so I was kind of trying to find a way to incorporate all of those things together in something that would not just be a priestess on a throne like we usually see on the card. And I thought that when you're thinking about like intuitive psychic power, you're also kind of thinking about how to see your situation or your world several steps ahead.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about the High Priestess as like a chess game where
Yeah.
she can control the board because she knows what the game is and she's already multiple steps ahead.
Yeah.
I wanted the High Priestess herself to be a bishop piece for that
Yeah.
sort of religious symbolism,
Mhm.
especially like a lot of older decks. That card is called the Popessa. And
Yeah.
so I thought having the bishop as the high priestess would be cool. And originally, the pillars on either side of her were going to be rooks, but I thought it'd be good to incorporate that femininity by making them queens instead of rooks. It was really handy since a chessboard already has black and white pieces. It's so easy to put a black and white queen pillar next to her.
Absolutely.
So a lot of that card, though, came from this idea that the High Priestess is somebody who can control the world around her because she understands it so completely that she is already 5 steps ahead of everyone else.
Oh, I
So,
love that so
kind of a
much.
test game.
That's very cool. I find the more I work with tarot, the more I move away from traditional gendered representations of the cards. Like, for me, when I started studying tarot, I was really thrown off by court cards, which I think a lot of people are, especially in traditional representation, where if it's this court card, then it's someone in your life who has this shade of hair or this physical
Right.
appearance. And it alienated me from being able to connect with my practice because it just didn't feel right. But I took Kimberly San from Fable's Den has an amazing court card course that she offers online.
Hmm.
And I took that, and it helped me open up my perspective of court cards as aspects of yourself or aspects of people in your life. But it's more
Yeah.
like we all fit into the page through King and, you know, all the wand court cards. Like all of us represent aspects of the Queen of Swords at some point in our life, or the King of Pentacles. And so being able to look at it from that perspective, not just generally as masculine or feminine, but just different archetypal representations of the human experience is really helpful. So I love that you've expanded it to move past that a little bit, because it feels very, again, with being accessible and you know, within reach for everyone, not just someone who happens to identify as masculine or feminine and is working with that particular card. So that's really, really cool.
I really appreciate you saying that, because when I started working on it, my view of tarot was more gendered than it is now. I'm still going to, almost just based on habit, I'm still going to apply femininity to a card like the Empress or the High Priestess, generally in my head. But I also have a much more like, what does that even mean kind of attitude about it, you know? But at the time, when I was very first making it, I wasn't thinking about that as much as I do now that a few years have passed. I also, when I started making the deck, I wasn't really making it for anybody other than myself. That's why the original Lover's card is two men, is because that's what I would like on the Lover's card. And so it has been really nice knowing that, like, I was making that deck mostly just for me in the beginning. It has been really nice hearing people who have really enjoyed it because they could see themselves in it, or felt like it had a diversity that a lot of tarot decks don't, or more and more do now, of course. But it has been nice, because at the time that I was making it, I wasn't really thinking very much about a diverse group of people. I was thinking about myself. And so it's been cool. And I don't know, it's just been really nice to hear people look at a card and be like, oh, I like that this isn't gendered, or that this is, I can't tell what age this person is, or, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I love that so much. Yeah, my own perception of tarot and gendering of tarot and just looking past those binary structures has really expanded over the last few years as well. And it's really interesting to look at where you were when you started, and then look at where you are now, and what that journey and progression has looked like, right? It's really
especially with something that traditionally is so gendered. In kind of a, like, for no real reason sort of a way too. Like, we don't need to think of the Queen cards as representing women in our lives, and it almost seems weird that we would, because it's not like the King and the Queen cards mean the same thing, just male or female. They mean completely different things, and so it's odd that you would think to apply gender to either of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting how helpful it can be to start creating an intimate relationship for yourself with cards. Like when I first started looking at court cards, it's like, oh, well, reference a person in your life that reminds you of that particular card. And so I immediately thought of someone who represented the Queen of Swords for me. And it's someone that I don't have a great relationship with and I struggle with. And so by association, I struggled with that card for a really long time, because I immediately thought of that person external to myself. But when I got rid of that and I started looking at some of the qualities of the Queen of Swords, the really healthy relationship with boundaries, being able to speak your truth, being firm, and being an advocate for other people too, because, there's this nurturing element of the Queens, but there's also this idea of advocating for the people around you and supporting the people around you in different capacities. I was able to claim ownership over that card, and now it's a card I relate to so much, right? So it's interesting how that kind of evolution can happen. And, the King of Cups is a card that I keep pulling in the last little while, and I think if I still associated that with a more masculine figure, I wouldn't feel as accessible to me. But now I see it more as an archetype, and it is. And so it's really interesting to be able to access those aspects of the cards in new ways, for sure.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely.
It's awesome. So I wanted to ask you too about the paper oracle. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm relatively new to Lenormand as compared to tarot, but I've really enjoyed taking a deep dive into the meanings of the cards and exploring that more for myself. And I was so excited when I saw this deck. So what was your process like for creating this one, and how did it differ, or how is it similar to the tarot process?
Similar in a lot of ways. Honestly, the big difference, as far as like the actual artistic process was incorporating more color.
Hmm.
With Inkwitch, it was really easy for everything to continue to look cohesive because I'm using like the same 10 colors throughout the entire deck. With Paper Oracle, I wanted something that was a lot more colorful. And
Yeah.
so it was kind of tricky to do that while also making something that looked like it all belonged together. So you'll notice in that deck, there's a lot of, I'll show you guys some cards. There's a lot of like circle
Yeah.
motifs.
Here for the
Um,
right.
yeah, a lot of the cards kind of have this round composition to them. And that was sort of a way for me to make the artwork look more cohesive while not having to worry about the color palette being the same.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a weird challenge. And the other big challenge was that when I started working on my Lenormand deck, I barely knew anything about Lenormand.
Yeah.
While I was working on my tarot deck and kind of getting it finished, I had decided it might be fun after I finished the tarot deck to make an oracle deck. And I was talking to my dad about that, and he suggested I look into Lenormand. And I was like, that might be better to do than an oracle deck because there's already a system here,
Oh my
uh,
God.
and I'm not having to like invent something.
Yeah.
I can kind of follow a format again. And so there was this whole, like, a lot more research went into it, I think, than the tarot deck did, because by the time I made my tarot deck, I'd already been doing tarot just on my own for several years. When I did the Lenormand deck, I learned Lenormand specifically so that I could make a Lenormand deck.
Oh,
It
very
wasn't
cool.
something that I had already been doing.
Yeah, but that's such a cool process to kind of learn as you create and
Yeah, it
incorporate
was.
that. Yeah, it's amazing. Now that you've mentioned the circles, I see them everywhere. It's beautiful.
Yeah, they're
Um,
all over the place.
yeah, yeah, but like even with, I love this tree and how you've
Oh,
created that. It feels like it's got a bit of Robin Hood, Sherwood Forest kind of
oh,
vibe.
it kind of does, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's beautiful. And the clouds, I love that there's the eye and the crystal ball. And I noticed that you have shifted a few of the cards. Like the scythe
Hmm.
is a knife instead, the
Yeah,
broom is in place of the whip. And then there's also the familiar instead of the dog. So what was your
yeah,
process like with that? I love those substitutions. I don't know if substitution's the right word, but those shifts in titles. So what
thank
was
you.
involved with that?
Well, one of the Lenormand decks that I learned Lenormand with was CLO Thompson's
Yeah.
Scrying Ink.
Hmm.
And she had kind of taken some of the traditional cards and changed them a little. Like, I think that her scythe card is scissors, maybe. And she used a broom instead of a whip, I think. Or maybe there was a broom and a whip. Can't
Okay.
remember.
Yeah.
But she had kind of changed it up a little bit. And when I was reading in her guidebook her explanations for why she made those changes that she did, a lot of those decisions really resonated with me. And I thought, this is really true. A big one for me was the scythe. I feel like the scythe is such a death symbol, whereas the scythe card, it does have to do with like cutting ties and ending things, but
Yeah.
it isn't as much of like a death tarot card as I think scythe symbolism would make it feel like it was. So I
That's a
didn't want it to be a scythe. I also felt like having a broom instead of a whip kind of made it feel like that card has a lot to do with resolving problems. And a
yeah.
broom feels a lot more like you could hit somebody with a broom. Like there's a stereotype about parents or grandparents using like a switch or whatever. But
Yeah.
it's also for cleaning, it's for sweeping, it's for restoring. And so I felt like a broom would be, for me, a more effective symbol for that
Yeah.
than a whip. And the familiar specifically, I changed that one just because I wanted the deck to kind of be witchier. I wanted
Yeah.
uh, a cat in it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, like, a familiar could be a dog or a cat. Like, it opens that up.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because, yeah. No, I love that so much. Yeah, my impression with those is there's a gentler feel to it. Like aside, like you said, is like that Grim Reaper, like very death associated, which is fine.
Right.
There's that clearing out that's associated, but like a knife still cuts through things, but it's less death oriented, which
Yeah.
feels like it opens up the understanding of that card. And like you said about the broom, there's that sweeping away that's involved, but it's less like when I see a whip or a scythe, it's a very kind of violent, aggressive vibe for
Mhm.
me personally. And so it made it more witchy and a little gentler, which I really appreciated. Yeah, and now that you've
Thank
mentioned
you.
circles, I can see it permeating everything, and I'm shocked that I didn't notice it before. And you're right, it creates a really beautiful through line for the entire deck and a sense
Thank
of
you.
cohesiveness for the artwork, which is amazing. And then you also have an additional 7 cards that you've added
Yeah.
to the deck, which I love. The non-binary card, as
Oh,
soon as I
yeah.
saw that, that's something I've been exploring for myself, and it was just, like I said, I've been kind of experimenting with moving away from a more binary masculine feminine, and I love
Mhm.
that you have masculine and feminine in the deck as well. But it's such a nice departure from the traditional man and woman depictions. It's like more looking at the energetics
Yeah.
around things. And then you've got the non-binary, which is incredible. And there's also the hourglass, which is
Mhm.
fabulous. I love the witchy vibe of that and the cauldron as well. And this storm card, oh my goodness, it is absolutely fantastic. I just love the energy of that.
Thank you.
And then scales, of course,
Mm.
and the stranger, like this is awesome. And then the wheel. So what was involved with picking out the extra cards? Were those extra images that you had created? Did you create them specifically to add on to the deck for a specific reason, or what was that process like?
Well, the non-binary card kind of started all of that. That was something that, again, CLO Thompson had done in her deck that I thought was really good. She had a man, a woman, and one that was called non-binary. And now I can't remember. I think maybe the non-binary card in her deck is like a deer or something. I can't really remember. But I thought it's a good thing to put in the deck as a non-binary significator. But I also didn't really want to do the man and the woman anyway. I sort of wanted just the concept of femininity and the concept of masculinity versus something that seemed like an actual person. That's why the cards are different. And with that, I wanted to add the non-binary one because the non-binary card could represent more than just a non-binary identity. It can also represent just non-binary thinking in general or thinking outside of the expected norm. And
Yeah,
so I thought having those cards representing not necessarily people, but potentially people
yeah.
um, would be handy. And then I think I just, while I was working on that, and I was like, well, if I'm going to do one extra card, I kind of wanted to make an Oracle deck anyway. I'll just make some more. I knew that I wanted the Storm in there to kind of, there wasn't a card that I felt like really hit that almost sort of like tower energy of like things being upheaved.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to put that in there. Same with the cauldron. That card represents like creativity and making things. And there's definitely some places in the deck where you can find creative power, but I felt like I wanted something that was much more specific. Like this is us putting ingredients together and doing alchemy to create a new something. And so it was just there were some concepts that I felt like would be nice additions to
Ah.
the traditional Lenormand, and so that's where most of the extra cards ended up coming from.
So awesome. I'm a huge, I have a background in I did a plant-based chef program, and I was involved in health and wellness for a little while, and got out of that because there's so many issues with elitism and restrictions.
Mm.
And, don't get me started. But I've loved cooking since I was in high school. I started meal planning and cooking for my family when I was 15. And the ritual of coming home from school and prepping a meal and looking at all these separate parts that came together to create something completely different. Like I love that cauldron card even more now that you've told me about it,
Absolutely.
because
Thank
there's
you.
something so magical in that process, right? And being a kitchen witch and the magic that you can create working with
Mm.
herbs and working with different ingredients. And just creating something. The creativity involved in that is really magical. So that's amazing. I love it so much. Um,
Thanks.
yeah, it's yeah, this is why I love guidebooks, and I adore speaking with creators like you, because it opens up your perspectives on the cards. Now every time I pick up this deck, I'm going to think of that reference point, and it makes it extra special. So
Thank
thank you
you.
for that.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
yeah, and how cool that your dad was the one to suggest a
Yeah.
Lenormand. Tell me about that.
You
Like,
know,
is he really into
um,
cards, or like what?
there's a
Yeah.
little bit of an embarrassing story there, but I'll share it anyway. I was on the phone with my dad, and I had like kind of just been in the process of wrapping up Inkwitch and like getting that pre-sale underway and everything, and was talking to him about how I've been thinking about like what's going to be next. Like I want to do more of this, and I think I'm going to make an Oracle deck next maybe, but I've got to come up with something, and I don't even
Yeah.
really know where to begin. And he goes, you should look up Lenormand because I think that that would be a good place to get started. And I thought he had said the name, Lenormand is a person, but I thought he had said Lenore Mond, that was like a woman's name, Lenore. And
Yeah.
so I was searching all over the internet for somebody named Lenore Mond and like could not find anything. And I was like, what was he talking about when he mentioned Lenore Mond? And so I was like, whatever, never mind. And I kept looking for Oracle deck stuff on my own, and I found Lenormand and did not put together that that was what he was
Right.
talking about. And so I like went to my parents and was like, I've been learning these new cards, this neat thing. And he was like, I told you about that we had that conversation. So that was kind of how I came into it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Learned what that was.
Oh, that's amazing. I do that too. Like I'll hear something and my brain will immediately think it's something specific, and then it ends up being the same thing. Like I joke with my husband about that a lot. So I'll say something and I'll be like, "Oh, this." He's like, "Yeah, that's what I was just talking about."
Right.
Like, it's funny how you can kind of have these kind of mindsets about things, right? Like it's yeah.
Absolutely.
So is he into Oracle and Tarot as well, or?
He's much more into tarot. My interest in tarot comes from my family. My mom started doing tarot when she was a kid and has kind of passed it on to the rest of us. My dad is a historian, and specifically, he is an early Christianity historian. So through that channel, he's become really interested also in the history of witchcraft and magic. And since my mom already kind of had a little bit of a tarot thing, it was something that my dad had access to easily through her. And so he's gotten into it as well. He wrote a book that got published, I think last year, maybe the year before, called The Cards, and it's about tarot's role in pop culture.
Oh my God.
Um, he's delivered some papers at conferences about tarot and history, so he's definitely more into tarot than Oracle or Lenormand. But through learning about the history of tarot, he's definitely learned some stuff about these other things, obviously, as well. Um, but yeah, it's a whole family thing now.
Oh my gosh, that is incredible. Your parents sound amazing.
They're very
I grew up
cool.
in Calgary, Alberta, which is like out west, Texas North, basically. And I come from like my dad's like super conservative, right
Oh yeah.
wing. Yeah, so that wasn't anything that was really within the realm of my experience. But the fact
Mhm.
that your dad is so focused on history and
Yeah.
incorporated tarot and all of that, that's incredible. I'm gonna have to look up his book. So what's his name, if you don't
His
mind
name is
sharing?
Patrick.
Patrick.
Patrick Maille. So yeah, you can find his name. His book is called The Cards.
That's
Um,
yeah.
it's through, I think, University of Michigan, maybe. I think
That's
maybe they're the
amazing.
ones who published it. I feel
Oh,
bad that I don't know off the top of my head,
oh
but
no, it's all good. It's so easy to find that now. I sometimes look back to, I'm 43, so my childhood in like elementary school and everything else. Like I remember getting my first internet account when I was in high school. It was like this big deal, right? And like my kids are horrified when I tell them that if I had to look something up, it meant going to the library and pulling out a physical
yeah,
book, doing research. So now it's so easy to find information.
it
But
really is.
I'm fascinated by the history of tarot and looking into, yeah, just the history of it and how it came about in different reference points and things. And it's so I'm really excited to
It
read the book and explore that. Yeah.
It is fascinating, and I love that like tarot and Lenormand both come from card games that were once so much more casual
Yes.
than tarot and Lenormand are, which I think is just so neat. It has made me kind of surprised that other things have not been adapted in that way. I think about that card game Loteria a lot. It's weird that I haven't seen that used for divination, or well, the Endless Oracles based off of Miriorama decks, and I made it because I thought that it was weird that I haven't seen those for divination. So I think that's a fascinating aspect of like the history of cartomancy in general in a broad sense.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I took Thomas from Hermit's Mirror had a course on using playing card decks for divination. And that was really exciting for me because I grew up playing gin rummy and crib with my grandmother on my dad's side and my grandfather on my mom's side. And that was such an integral part of growing up. And it was so cool to be able to look at these cards that I'm so familiar with in a new light that feels very accessible to where my personal practice is now. And it's so exciting to me able to make, and like from what I understand, some of the origins of tarot is being used as a card game in Italy, right? So it's
Right.
amazing to see these things and the evolution of that practice and the different associations that people give it now as opposed to way back when, right? Because in a lot of circles it's sacrilegious. I have an aunt who's very devoutly religious and can't even say the word tarot around her, right? So it's but it started off as a deck of playing cards, right? And the weight and the meaning that you ascribe something with can shift and change over time, and that process is fascinating to me. The
It is.
evolution. Yeah.
I love that weight that you ascribe to something, like you just said. We've done that with tarot just as a culture, but I kind of like the idea that you could just do that with anything that you wanted to. I like
Yeah.
the idea that like the magic that we have in tarot, it's only there because we say it's there. We're putting it there by using it as a tool. And I saw, like I've seen funny TikTok videos that are people using like Pokemon cards or Uno cards, but it's kind of like you can ascribe that power to whatever you want to. I think that's part of why Oracle decks are cool, is because they are just made up by whoever made them. It's not like Tarot and Lenormand, which have a really rich history with a specific format. Like you will see like the Fool and the Magician in every deck, more or less. And I think Oracle cards are fun because it is so much of a like I made this thing and it's new and it's fresh and you've never seen it before, but it does have the same power because we're putting it there by using it for our practice.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. And when you think about it, I remember hearing, well, many people say that like this is a piece of cardstock.
Right,
The
yeah.
fact that it has meaning is because we ascribe meaning to it. We give it power, we give it gravitas because it's important to us, and it
Hmm.
has a meaning and an association. And like my husband is very kind of practical and down to earth, and he isn't into any of this. Like he respects my practice, and he's so supportive, and I love that. But for him, like he can't wrap his head around astrology and talking about birth charts all the time and oh it's rising and that moon and that means this, and his eyes glaze over, and he's very respectful of the fact that it means something to me. But I think he sees so much more meaning in tarot because it's like it's a way to access your intuition. It's a way to form a deeper relationship with yourself and make meaning out of your current experience. So that makes sense to him, and that's very much what I use it for. But it's so interesting because yeah, the baseline it's a piece of paper that you can use as a tool to access your intuition, to access your spirituality, to access those parts of yourself that may be inaccessible otherwise. And I don't know about you, but when I'm doing a tarot reading, sometimes there's things that are going on in my life that I'm either not aware of or maybe I'm aware of but don't really want to address. But when I have a card that comes up and is physically in front of me, then I can face up to it easier, or maybe I'm
Yeah.
forced to reconcile myself to it because it's a concrete example of that thing that is part of my current experience, right? And there's
Yeah.
something so powerful to that.
I love that. One thing I've actually learned through my dad, I wish I could remember this person's name, but my dad has told me about a psychologist who used tarot
Oh my
because
God.
of that very reason, that
Yeah.
he could help his patients to sort of reach certain parts of themselves that they weren't aware of or weren't willing to acknowledge they were sort of maybe subconsciously aware of. It sort of lets you open these doors that are hard to open otherwise. Or maybe you don't even know that that door is there, but as you're kind of working through it with a tool that's helpful like tarot, you can kind of reach those places. And I think it's really kind of neat that you don't even have to be doing something witchy with it. You can just be doing a psychology analysis with somebody,
Yeah.
and it's still a helpful thing in the right context.
Yeah, and like the archetypes of tarot are things that are accessible to anyone, whatever your belief system,
Yeah.
because it's an archetype, it's a structure. Like we all have people in our lives or aspects of ourselves that exemplify the creation energy of the Empress or the assuming personal, taking ownership of your personal power that I've come to associate with the Emperor, right? Everyone has that in them in some capacity, and you don't have to be a witch or, ascribe to some of the more mystical aspects of tarot to be able to find that accessible, which is really
Completely.
powerful. And again, I love that you've integrated elements of mythology and legend into this deck because that it's so wonderful to see the Hanged Man and to think about Odin and his hanging upside down and gaining knowledge and losing an eye and all of these different aspects that are can be directly related to that Hanged Man card and that aspect of that journey and that search for knowledge and shift in perspective that the Hanged Man and that forced pause, right? All of those
Mm.
elements that meld so beautifully with that aspect of the story. It's really beautiful. Um, so yeah, I wanted to. We're already at an hour. Thank you so much for meeting with me. I just wanted to ask you a few questions about the Endless Oracle. You'd
Of
referenced
course.
a deck that you used as reference to that or as inspiration for that. What was the deck that you had mentioned?
It's called, I think the one you're talking about is called A Series of Many Thousand Landscapes or something like that. It is the first time, as far as I could tell, I could absolutely be wrong about this, but I think it's the first time that the word Muriel-Rama was used. This guy made a deck called Muriel-Rama, A Series of Many Thousand Landscapes, and the idea was that it was just pictures of pieces of a landscape, and you could arrange them into any order and get a cohesive panorama. And so you're winding up, even with just a few cards, I think that deck has like 20 cards in it.
Yeah.
You're winding up with just infinite, near infinite possibilities of what that panorama could look like. And I learned about Miramas in general from an Instagram user called Pocket Knife Tarot who had
Oh
um,
yeah.
been talking about how it was strange that they'd never seen that as a divination tool, and we kind of
Mhm.
both did some research and like met back up, and neither of us could find a deck that had been made with that mechanic in mind for divination. We did find some people who do tarot and oracle who were using Miriorama games as divination tools, but not ones that had been made for divination. And so I thought, well, I have to have something like that. Like I've got to have that. And so,
Absolutely.
so it's like I guess I've just got to make it myself then.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but there's several Murioramas out there. There's a bunch of card games and just little picture games that people have made over the years. But that series of many thousand landscapes, I think, is the first time that that word shows up,
Oh,
and that was in maybe like the 1800s.
okay. I love that this deck evolved out of your desire to create something that you weren't able to find yourself. I've talked to a
Yeah.
lot of people whose artwork and creation and tarot or oracle has emerged from something that they were looking to find. And
Mm.
then we're like, okay, well, it's not out there, so I'm going to create it myself and fill that gap and create something because then it's not just something that's filling that void for you. It's something that is
Yeah.
introducing this medium to so many other people, which is so amazing. I
Mm.
was thinking actually of James R. Eads' Prisma Visions and Cosma Visions,
Oh,
or because with those decks, if you lay out the cards in sequence, it creates a really long mural of artwork. So you see the progression of the major arcana
That is
through
so
one
cool.
mural, and then the same with the minor arcana. If you lay everything out, like I did this exercise when I first arrived, I'm like, it looks like this is in sequence, and sure enough, I laid it out, and it was this whole progression of images. But that's the closest I've found to that idea, and I'm not sure that you could switch them around.
Hmm.
And I love that there's that interchange of
Yeah.
creation that comes from mixing it up. So if you've got this card and that card, or this card and another card, you can still create meaning and a connection and cohesion with that.
Hmm.
That's amazing. Um, oh, I love that so much. And I also
I have
wanted to. Oh, sorry. Go
Uh,
ahead.
I was just going to say, you were talking about the deck arising from like filling I want to have this thing, so I need to make it kind of issue. But I've had this thing really honestly since I made Inkwitch,
Yeah.
that I don't really want to make a deck that is not something that I'm making because I want to have it.
Hmm.
I want other people to want to have it too.
Yeah.
Like this is my job and I have bills to pay. But
Yeah.
but it's such a time consuming, emotionally draining, labor
Yeah.
intensive project that I feel like I have to make something that I'm still going to be happy I made it, even if no one else cares about it.
Yeah.
If the only deck that winds up getting printed is mine, I still
Yeah.
need to have made something that makes that
Yeah.
okay. And so all of the decks that I've made so far and hopefully make in the future will I feel like that's got to be the priority. As much as I want other people to like my work, it's
Yeah.
got to be something that I am making for myself too.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, everyone's going to have opinion on everything that you
Oh,
create. And
absolutely.
so
Yeah.
coming at it from that perspective of this is something that I want to create that resonates with me, I feel like you can always tell when someone's made something because they think it's going to be lucrative and it's going to sell versus they made something because it's near and dear to their heart. It's something that they want to put out in the world because it has meaning to them. Like that, to me, is so powerful because it's coming out of something that has meaning and significance to you, right? And that in and of itself, like you said, even if you have the one deck that resonates with you, but I think it has more meaning and more impact for other people because
I
you can
think
always
so.
intuitively feel that connection with the
Yeah.
work that's being creative, right? If someone creates something and it has an intimate meaning and significance to them, there's so much love and care that gets poured into that. Not that there can't be love and care that's poured into something else, but there's an extra level of connection with that that I feel is so
Hmm.
important and significant. And it kind of references back to what we were talking about in the beginning when you create something just for the fun of it and not even with the intention of it evolving
Yeah.
into something. It's a magic that comes with that creative evolution and that process that is so
Yeah.
powerful. Yeah. And with regards to the Endless Oracle, you also have 3 patron expansion cards, the artist,
Yeah.
the fortune teller, and the patron, right? Which is associated with your Patreon. And I wanted
Right.
to talk to you about your Patreon account and how you got that set up and created because I'm a patron now and I'm super excited. But what was that process like for you of creating that space and creating that sense of community?
What's funny is I actually made my Patreon when I was in college in like 2016, I think, because part of my capstone project in college was that I was making a webcomic.
Oh,
And
cool.
I never finished it. I want to go back to it someday.
Yeah,
But it was part of my work in school was to make a webcomic, and I wanted to have a Patreon to go with it, just so that people who wanted to support it could.
yeah,
So I made that Patreon and then never ended up doing anything with it. And then when I made the tarot deck, I had kind of the same thought process that like I want to keep doing this, and that's much easier if I've got a little bit of a flow of income
yeah,
between projects. And
yeah.
so I found my old Patreon. So that Patreon has been there since like 2016, but
Oh
it's
my
only
goodness.
really been like being used for the
Yeah,
past couple of years.
yeah,
But it has made such a big impact. I feel like, I mean, a big part of why I've been able to work on art full time is because Inkwitch has done so well.
yeah,
But another big part of it is just that I have people who are willing to send me a little bit of money each month to work on things, and it has made such a huge impact. And not even just, it's had a big financial benefit to it, of course, just because, like I said earlier, there are bills. But it has also just been nice to have that community. There's the community here on Instagram, which I'm eternally grateful for and I love. But it has been really nice having something that feels a little bit more intimate and a little bit more personal, and just like we're here because we want the Endless Oracle to happen, or whatever. It has really been beneficial in so many ways. I made those extra cards because I just wanted to really have something special for those people who've been helping me make this deck happen for the past year. And I think there's a lot of people on the Kickstarter who are kind of disappointed that those cards aren't more accessible to everyone. But it's because I need them to be special for the people that I made them for. And I also hope that they'll encourage people to give the Patreon a try too. I want them to give it a chance and see if maybe they'll really like it and think, well, I want to join this, so that whatever he makes next can happen a little bit faster, a little bit easier. But I made those cards just because I felt like patrons needed a treat.
It's so lovely, and the thing is, it's a tangible representation of the support that people are giving you within the community for your work, and I really appreciate that Patreon gives that opportunity for connection and for community. That, I mean, that when people are joining and supporting you financially like that, there's a like-mindedness and a sense of appreciation of your art, and people can come together who have similar focus and appreciation, and it just fosters a really beautiful sense of community for sure.
For sure. And, like I said, I don't want to sound like I don't get so much from the support on other platforms too. Because I feel like doing something as simple as liking an artist's post is worth a lot to that artist. I know that it's worth a lot to me. But just anytime there's somebody in an artist audience who's willing to do that little bit extra, like join Patreon or whatever, it is very special.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's amazing. It's really wonderful that platforms like that are available to be able to support the artists that you respect and admire. That's really amazing. Yeah, so the Endless Oracle, September 5th, for anyone who missed that before. That's really exciting. I mean, I have such appreciation for you as an artist and for everything that you've put out. This is really incredible, and I feel very privileged to be able to chat with you like this. This is really awesome. Thank you for joining me so much.
I feel privileged to chat with you.
Amazing. And for anyone who didn't have a chance to join us, I'll be sharing this on my IGTV so you can catch it later. Thanks again for taking time to join me and have this wonderful conversation. I'm really excited to look up your dad's book, and I've been making notes as we've gone through for references that I want to look up afterwards, because I really appreciate everything that you shared. It's really amazing. So thank you again for joining me. And
absolutely. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
You too. Yeah. Absolutely. Take care.
Awesome. You too. Thanks.
Take care. Bye.